thought I was going to be out of place. But with this group of rebels, I don't know. When I got this invitation, I accepted immediately when Bob sent it. First of all, because the Voice of the Faithful, I think, is a very, very important movement. And secondly, the number of people who are here, these are people I admire, people, some of whom I've been privileged to work with. And so I'm happy, in spite of the fact I don't have a shirt and tie on, that I somehow do belong here. The Vicar General of my diocese in San Diego sent me a letter about a month ago and said that I would no longer be welcome in the Chancery office. I had been there several times, but I would no longer be welcome there. And he gave two reasons, but the most prominent reason was that I associate with Jeff Anderson. So I'm proud to be in Minneapolis and St. Paul and Jeff's bailiwick. Now, I'll tell you that the invitation inspired me, and I really do mean that, because it got me started to do something I had been wanting to do for years. And it was to write out something that I called the Confessions of an Expert Witness. I felt I had to tell this story, and it's ended up with more than 60 pages. I'm not going to burden you with that, although you inspired it. I'm going to try and give you 9 sentences, 9 statements that form the bulk of it. But I'll tell you exactly how it started. I did not want to be an expert witness in a case of sexual abuse of a priest against a minor. A lawyer from Arkansas called me, and I said, no, I'm not going to do this. And so I had written a book in 1990, and it was on the basis of that he asked me to do that. And so I said no, and then he showed up in Baltimore, where I was living at the time. And my wife said to me, you've got to do it. She said, the church is not going to listen to anything else but this kind of pressure. So I want you to do it. So I did. I started. I went through several hours. I think there were over 8 hours of deposition. 5 lawyers came because it was a military ordinariate. A lawyer for the military ordinariate, a lawyer for the order the man belonged to, 2 lawyers for the diocese, and a lawyer for the insurance company. And this was not the first deposition I'd given. I'd given in some other case, but it wasn't an abuse case. And so I weathered that. You know what it is, it's 8 hours of telling you how dumb you are and stupid and you don't know anything, you have no validity, and how dare you say any of this. And so I half agreed with him on some of that, so I just, I just said what I knew. Then we got to trial, went to trial. This was the trial of a priest who had been in the Army, Air Force, excuse me. I wanted to spare you.
I was on that too. On the same case.
So, and he had written a letter and said he had abused these 2 girls. He wrote it to the father, who was, he considered his good friend, the father of the girls, and said when they were 5 and 6 years old, for about a year, he abused these 2 girls. So I was on the stand. It was 2 hours in testimony and 4 hours in cross-examination. And I weathered that. But I looked out from my place on the witness stand, and there was a very kind, soft-spoken black judge who was sitting to my right above me. There was the court reporter taking notes in front of him, and on my right were the jurors. Not a Catholic among them I knew, but a group of Arkansas people, mostly blonde-haired, blue-eyed Methodist Baptists, who I thought were very attentive during the trial. On my left were 3 or 4 bishops, the bishops from the place, the bishops from the ordinariate, the head of the religious order. There were then also the lawyers there and a couple of priests. Here in front of me was this young girl, now 21 years old. And she sat there and she was cowering. I had met this young woman and I read her history. Her sister didn't want to come forward, but she did. And she sat there cowering. And I sat in this, I had answered all the questions. And I want to tell you what happened to me. The judge turned to me and he said, "What is your opinion?" And you know what I said? "I don't have any opinion." Can you imagine? I don't have any opinion. What stopped me? What blocked me? I mean, it was a very, very, very profound experience in my life. Why? Because I had a direct report from a priest who knew the priest he didn't come. The evidence was all there against him. He didn't come to the trial. Who reported to me that he knew that he was sexually abusing other kids. I had in my file a letter from the bishop of the ordinariate, of the military ordinary, that said to a superior who was saying, "This priest has gotten into trouble, he's been a sexual abuser, should I pull his endorsement? And the bishop from the ordinariate wrote, "No, don't pull his endorsement. Let him resign, because that's an umbrella that covers a multitude of sins." I also had in my file, I had interviewed a young woman who was abused by a priest who was on the staff of the ordinariate, military ordinary, who was living with her mother and had abused her when she was 12 years old. I had all this. I mean, what more ammunition would I have to be confident and say I have an opinion about this? I answered all my questions. Why couldn't I say it? You know, Tom writes about religious duress. I know what it is. I know what it is. I know how it can shut you up. Not because you're not convinced of something, but because somehow all of this education, all of the Roman collars stand for something. People say, "Oh, why don't these victims come forward? Why don't they talk? Why don't they say something?" I know why. I know why. I was a big boy at this time, you know. I will never forget that experience. And I wanted to write not only that experience, but taking off from there at the invitation of the Voice of the Faithful. Well, what have I learned? Now that I can be aligned with all these radical people, you know, now that I can be kicked out of Bishop's office, you know, what do I have to say for myself? Well, I'm not going to be frightened anymore. I'm going to distill just 9 questions, and I hope that they can offer you some substance for asking questions and discussions. And my first statement is this: sexual abuse by clergy is neither new, it has a long history, and it is not over. It is part of history, and it's a very important history that is beginning to be told. Secondly, that the current concern about sexual abuse of minors by clergy is not because of moral leadership of the bishops. It is not. It is because of several things. I put 5 things. First of all, the American legal system changed from the 1960s on. Child protection laws were enacted in the states and it gave people some backing to stand on. So the legal system. Secondly, the survivors and the victims themselves. They're the ones who have given this whole, the push to this whole movement. there wouldn't be any press, there wouldn't be any lawyers, there wouldn't be any of the pressure. There wouldn't be any voice of the faithful if it were not for the victims and survivors who've had the guts to stand up. And I was talking to Steve this evening, and I said, this is not going to stop because this is a movement. And you can't stop a movement as long as people are moving. The third thing is the legal intervention. There have been lawyers who have been willing to stand up and defend a very unpopular cause. And one of the premier ones in this whole country is Jeff Anderson. Jeff is to me a spiritual hero because he has stood up. And I've worked with 54 lawyers across this country in over 173 cases. And many of them are Catholic lawyers who are astounded by what they learn about the church. It has taken a great deal of heroism to get into this fray. I'm very tired, by the way, of magazines and bishops and so on. Say, well, those lawyers are just greedy for money. The hell they are. They're greedy for justice. You know. The fourth thing is the press. And the press has been very significant in all this. There are many people who date this crisis to January 6, 2002, when the Boston Globe took this. Well, Jason Berry, Tom Fox, from the Catholic press pushed this, touched this taboo, and gave it some legs to stand on. It's in that tradition. But the press has been a tremendous force. And the fifth thing is the demand for accountability. I don't think that's going to go away. I think that this is a mobilization that is historic. And I think it's in the genuine spirit. I've thought about this. You know, people talk about Vatican II and oh, that's past and all this and that. This is Vatican II in action. This is what Vatican II is all about. Sharing, activism, and so on. So, it is not the bishops who've led this movement. These are the forces. You are the forces who've led this movement. And thirdly, I will say, and I will stand on this, that we are emerging into a neo-Catholic era. This is a neo-Catholic era. You can't go back. You can't go back to the bishops as they were. You can't go back to the sexual teaching as it was. In some way, I go back and compare this to the Reformation. I go through the evolution of the Reformation. When do you pinpoint the Reformation? I mean, there are certain dates along that time. In this new era of Catholicism, one of the dates is going to be January 6, 2002. It was the biggest story of that year, and it continues. Fourthly, the hierarchy has lost moral authority in sex. I don't know of serious thinking Catholic who is going to ask the bishop about any sexual matter. There's no authority there. There's no confidence there. Fifth, and Steve said this beautifully, I think we all know this now, and it's very important to know, that the sexual abuse of minors by Catholic is a symptom. It's an important problem, there's no question. But is it a symptom of something that's wrong in the system? It's a system of sexually wrong, a sexually wrong core to it. The sixth thing is that the centrality of celibacy. You know, people say, oh, bishops over and over. This has nothing to do with celibacy. I don't know what it has to do with if you have a priest or a bishop who is promised perpetual and perfect chastity and never to marry if he's out abusing kids. If that doesn't have to do with celibacy, I don't know what. I mean, it's certainly it's the negative. Well, what they're all talking about is that the rule of celibacy that doesn't count. You just can't change that. I agree with them with that. I have never attacked the rule of celibacy. What I've attacked is the non-practice of celibacy by those who profess it, who use it as a cover. It is the sexual activity underneath the cloak of that system. And if that's not a problem, I don't know what is. And it's not just limited to sexual abuse of minors. The other thing is, and I don't know why people don't talk about this, the Catholic Church demands of lay people a celibate morality. Why? When can you have sex? When you're married, and only when you're married. So you cannot have a sexual thought, word, desire, or action outside marriage. It's all mortally sinful. There's no what they call paucity of matter. It's all mortal. French kiss, I mean, how many times when I was teaching, well, Father, is it mortal to French kiss? I said, well, who are you French kissing? Are you French kissing a poodle? You're French kissing. I mean, it's all this act orientation. You know? You've been there, Tom. I know. We get those questions. Why people, do you bring up your kids that you may never have a sexual thought, word, desire, or action until you get married, and if you do, by God, you're going to go to hell? Is that what you teach? My son is 30 years old. Well, my wife hates this when I said, he's living in sin. Actually, it's kind of lessened now because he's engaged. But I can tell you this. If he is 31 years old, has never had a sexual thought, word, desire, or action in his life, I'm going to be very disappointed in him. I did not send him to Harvard University to act that way. It's not normal. But where are the people standing up and saying, that's not normal? You know, what they do is they silently slink away and say, I don't believe that on contraception. Or they can't even openly talk about, you know, my wife is a psychiatrist. We worked in therapy for years. You know, sometimes people come to you in terrible binds, in a pregnancy that is very, very difficult to ascertain. And that you are stuck with a very deep moral bind, not as a therapist, but in guiding this person. But where's the talk about this? Oh no, it's just absolute. You know? All this stuff is just absolute. Why, I cannot figure out why people cannot rebel against the celibate morality that is being foisted on them. I don't believe it. And I don't believe most rational people believe that way. There is, seventh, a problematic equation that's attached to this. And Tom talked about it in terms of Tom and Pat and some of the others of you and Terry Dosh. We're all on a metaphysically superior level. You probably didn't know that. But if you looked at spirituality, if you looked at metaphysics, we would be kind of floating above the crowd. Why? Ordination did that to us. Ordination did that to us. We have the sign. And it's given to us in perpetuity. You can't take it away. Priest forever. You can be dispensed. You can get married. But that mark is there. Now, here's the point of this. That problematic equation is priest equals celibate. Priest doesn't equal celibate. Priest equals a person who is not legally married and can't be legally married by the law. And he should not be sexually active. You know, there are very bright people. Andrew Greeley does this all the time. He talks about celibates are just as happy as married laymen. Celibates are just as successful. Well, what does he mean? Well, he means, well, the Los Angeles Times did a survey of priests and found out they're just as happy as laymen. Well, you know, why the hell shouldn't they be? They've got perpetual support. They have employment unquestioned, even they have their insurance paid. They have their food paid, all of this. And if they want sex, they can go and have it. I mean, what the hell? It sounds pretty good sometimes to some people. You know? And celibate has nothing to do with a person whether he is having sex or not in that context. And we have to get used to that. We're afraid to say, Father, are you having a sexually active life? You're preaching to me about contraception from the pulpit. You're preaching to me about abortion from the pulpit. You're preaching to me about marital fidelity from the pulpit. I'm willing to listen and dialogue with you. But Father, are you having a sexually active life? Father, you've taught me that masturbation is a mortal sin, and I'm going to go to hell if I masturbate, or my daughter is going to masturbate. Father, do you ever masturbate? Those are forbidden questions. You say, oh, you can't ask that. Why the hell can't I ask that? That's the content of their moral teaching to me as a layman. That's the content of their preaching to me. We have to get out of this idea that priest equals celibate. A priest can equal celibate. I have never, you've read any of my books, you know that I've never pulled down celibacy. I've never contradicted the ideal of celibacy, giving up everything in the service of someone. I've never knocked that. What I have said is, how do those people practice it who profess it? And I think that's a legitimate question. I think that equation is a myth, and we have to talk about it. The eighth thing is that the church, that the priesthood, the structure of the church is homosocial. You've got to be a man, in the biological sense, to be a priest, to have any power. And in order to be a priest, you have to be celibate. Therefore, you can't be married, and you have to say that you're not going to have any sex of any kind, and that's perpetual. Now, the church says, and this is one of the big problems that has to be discussed, that homosexuality is intrinsically evil. That's an intrinsic evil, and people who are genetically, or people who are oriented with a homosexual orientation, that's not sinful. They're terribly distorted, and they're inclined to an intrinsic evil. But it's okay, as long as they don't do anything. That's a problem. It's a problem for society. It's a problem for us. I'm going to make this statement, and it's the first time I'm making it publicly, and I'm willing to stand by it. My estimate is that at least 30% of the American hierarchy, that's from cardinals, archbishops, and bishops, are homosexual in orientation. And I'm not saying that to throw a rock in their garden. I'm saying that to say, look, you've got to talk to us from a base of reality. If you want to talk about the morality of homosexuality, then talk to us as real people. And talk to us honestly. And this whole question, have you read in the papers, what we're supposed to do is to keep those damn dirty homosexuals out of the seminary. No homosexuals in the seminary. They're inclined that way, get rid of them. Oh, isn't that interesting? That's going to solve the problem. You know how we're going to solve some other problems of homosexuality? Well, let's create our prisons. And let's only put heterosexual men in certain prisons. And then we won't have any sexuality in that prison, will we? It's all going to be gone. Because they're all heterosexuals there. I mean, this is the same stupidity that is placed by the church. The point is, there are a great many people who come in. My estimate from my studies of celibacy in the church, my estimates of homosexuality in terms of orientation has always been lower than those that priests and bishops give. Why is that? Because I think a great deal of the homosexual behavior within the ministry is situational, is caused by the system, is fostered by the system. You think about it. Why aren't they willing to talk about this in an intelligent way? I'm not saying anything other than, look, if you're going to preach this, let's talk about it honestly. Let's preach it honestly. Let's get rid of, if you want to, the bishops want to, you want to get rid of homosexuality in the priesthood, in the seminary, don't start from the candidates. Start from the people on top. There's a ninth thing I'd like to talk about, and that my own examination of conscience, is my own confessions as an expert witness and what it's challenged me to, is I'd like to talk about the myth of forgiveness. Yeah. Forgiveness is very freely preached. Look, forgive. You've been offended. Forgive. Well, you know, that's not a bad doctrine. We look at Jesus Christ, and he's on the cross, and he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. I believe it was a real sense of forgiveness. You know, this is torture, this is unfair, this is unjust. I think it's wonderful. I think that kind of forgiveness frees one up. I don't have any grudge against anybody. I'm not burdened with that, with spite or revenge or so on. But that's far easier to preach. But look who they're preaching it to. The abused. Forgive us. You'll be much holier. Oh, you'll be so much happier. Just forgive us. But let's think about the forgiveness of the abuser. Let's think about the forgiveness that the bishop is asking. Forgiveness is dependent, and it's harder to be forgiven. Think about it. What's required? Well, first of all, you have to accept full responsibility for your violation. Isn't that right? I mean, anybody. So it's not these empty apologies. Think of what the apology always, oh, I'm so sorry for the pain you've gone through. I'm so sorry for all this. Excuse me or forgive me if I come through mocking. I mean to be. You know? I find so much of it, I don't find, and I can't hear bishops getting up, religious superiors getting up and saying, I sinned against you. I sinned against you by neglect. It's my sin, and I need to be forgiven. Not this thing, I'm sorry. No, by God, I am a sinner. Secondly, it takes restitution or retribution. You can't be forgiven for things just because you say a cheap I'm sorry. And I'm going to say by God, and I think I mean it by God. I'm involved in this at the inspiration of my wife. And do I think the church should make restitution? Yes, I think the church should make restitution. Am I worried if a diocese goes into bankruptcy? I'm not. I'm not. Steve Rossetti said this in 1992 to a group of Porter's victims. We were on a TV program in Boston. And they said to him, Father, how can we help the church change? What can we do to make the church change? He said, and I quote, the church will not change until it's threatened with bankruptcy. Yes. I'm going to hear you right after. I just want to finish this thing.
Took the Aryan nation down. He prescribed that that's the only way the Aryans were going to fall.
Well, this is
question, please.
Pardon me?
Would you repeat?
She's going to come to the microphone and say that later.
Oh, yeah, let's wait with the question.
Yeah, she's going to say that. But the point is that I don't feel guilty about that. And I'm willing to show you my bank book. I'm willing to show you my tax report. I'm willing to show you the amount of tax I pay. It's very interesting because I usually don't know, because my wife takes care of everything. I literally don't. There's lots of things I'm stupid about. My wife knows much better. But I've had a deposition. This is most of the time in a deposition. They're always trying to, how much do you charge per hour? You know, who's paying for this? I'm not ashamed to say, yes, I do charge for my services. But they said, well, how much do you make? And I've never known. But just before I went on this deposition, my wife was filling out the taxes, and she said, you know how much you made last year? I said, no, I didn't know. She said, can I say it here publicly or public disclosure?
He never listens to you. Right?
Yeah. Look, I made $75,000 last year. And I work damn hard. I'm not ashamed of that. You know? And I don't think I have to be apologized for it.
Charge more.
You know? So I told him. I said, yeah. My wife just told me she made out the taxes, and I made $75,000 last year. You know? You know, I didn't used to, when I started this work, I never charged. And then, again, my smart wife, she said, you know, the church is paying for this. My fees went up. Restitution. This money that they're giving, this is not money that is superfluous. This is restitution. This is just payment for your sins. And what are your sins? For not doing anything about this, for not standing up. And the third thing, all of you know, we all learned it in grade school, those who went to Catholic grade school, a firm purpose of amendment, which means, damn it, I'm not going to do that again. I'm not going to do that again. And you know, these bishops aren't like little kids, pre-adolescents coming in and confessing masturbation because they're going to hell.
Let's hold the questions, please.
The point is, these are people who are saying, oh, well, it's all over, it's history. It's not history. You have not made restitution, and you have not fulfilled your promise that this is not going to happen again. Why? Because in order for it not to happen again, you have to change. You have to fundamentally change. You have asked me as my spiritual leader and my spiritual advisor, and you've talked to me about conversion. And I try that. I take you seriously. I have to convert. I have to transform, not just change. I have to transform myself. I have to think more about my behavior. Well, you taught me that, and I'm going to challenge you with that. So anyway, that's the confession of an expert witness. I'm sorry for all my sins, and I'm gratified for what I've learned from all of you, and I thank you all.
How to follow that? How to follow this whole panel? My name is David Clossie. I'm from St. Louis, the National Director of SNAP. I'm thrilled to be here. You know, Boston is often referred to, as Richard alluded to, falsely, as the epicenter of this crisis. I think of the Twin Cities, frankly, as being kind of the quiet epicenter, because long before January of '02, because of Belinda's leadership, because of Bob's leadership, Mike's leadership, because of the work of Jeff and his staff, victims were coming forward here quietly, long before things exploded on the East Coast. This is one of the first places where victims had the courage to go into court and seek justice, one of the first places where victims began the incredibly painful uphill struggle of trying to change the laws. So this, to me, is a wonderful place to be, and it warms my heart to look out and see some wonderful people, Benia and Walter and Claudia and Mike, Scott and Craig and the folks who work with Jeff. This is I do a lot of traveling, and this is a wonderful place for me to come and visit. Like Tom, I'll talk tomorrow. Like it or not, I'll talk more tomorrow. So I'll be brief tonight. I'm a big Q&A fan, and so I'm always anxious to hear and learn from the crowd. But I'll make two quick points. You know, Steve talked about and quoted the NCR this question of whether or not we're in a different phase now because of the release of the John Jay report and the self-audit. And I think I don't think we are. I think the bishops are in a different phase, and I can express that phase probably best non-verbally. A month or so ago, this was the phase that the bishops were in. And now, I think bishops have launched a new phase. And non-verbally, here's the new phase. I think they are, as a group generally, and hunker down. They're done apologizing. They're done parsing out what tiny bits of information they feel they absolutely have to produce to satisfy a relentless criticism. They're beginning to keep, sadly, they're beginning to keep more and more accused priests in ministry. They're even beginning to return some to ministry. They're allowing more of them to start again to use the hardball tactics. Monsignor Gaffney in Staten Island, New York, filed a $2 million slander suit against a victim who hadn't even sued him. Just this morning in Los Angeles, there was the deposition of a Monsignor Alzugare, who is suing not only his victim, Aaron Brady, for slander, but is also suing SNAP for the first time in our 14-year history of being sued for slander, even though, ironically, the Los Angeles Times and the Los Angeles Archdiocese were the two entities that first put Monsignor Alzugare's name out there as an abuser. So three organizations outed him, if you will, and the only one who's being sued for slander is our support group. But we're seeing a lot more of this kind of hunker-down attitude on the part of bishops. And sadly, that is also seems to be the attitude across the waters. Jason's book does a terrific job of, I think, beginning to really get at the mindset in the Vatican. And I'm sure many of you saw the reports about 3 weeks ago of a Vatican-sponsored panel of experts who said this one-strike rule is a little bit too harsh. It's a little bit too one-size-fits-all. It needs to be reevaluated. And of course, this summer, the bishops will begin to evaluate and rethink this policy that has actually been in place literally 1 year now. It was March of 2003 that the so-called zero-tolerance rule first took effect. So we've had decades and decades, or I guess more accurately, Patrick and Richard speak to this, we had literally centuries of a multiple tolerance policy. And we've now had, at least in this one country for 1 year, an official, sporadically enforced, but officially a 1 year, one-strike policy. And now it's time to reevaluate it because it may be too harsh. So I think that's the period that we're in. Bishops feel that the worst is over. And I think by their behavior you can see that they truly believe that they've done what they need to do. So where does that leave us? Where do we go from here? I guess I want to make three very quick points. And one is that in terms of answering that question, what do we do now? Where do we go from here? I think there are two key questions to ask. One is, does what we do make it easier and more likely that victims will come forward? Because Richard spoke to this very, very eloquently. Prosecutors can't prosecute, police can't investigate, lawyers can't sue, journalists can't write unless victims come forward. And regardless of what you think about the performance of the bishops, I think everyone in this room and every thinking Catholic knows that ultimately whatever reforms have happened have happened only because people like some of the people I named a few minutes ago found the courage to come forward and speak up. So that's the first question. What do we do from here? Does it make it easier and more likely that victims will come forward? And the second question I think we should ask ourselves is, does what we do take power away from bishops? And as you could probably guess, my view is that if it doesn't, then we're not getting at the core. Look back to that self-audit. I don't know how closely people read that. But if you think about what have bishops done? There's been a flurry of activity. There's no doubt. I'll be the first to concede that bishops have done a lot since January of 2002. They simply haven't done the right things. Think about what they've done. If you look at that self-audit, bishops patted themselves on the back for finally having now written codes of conduct in almost every diocese for Catholic priests. They've begun to fingerprint their staffs. They've begun to do background checks on the staffs that they hire. They've begun to train lay people in recognizing sexual abuse. They've now designated one person in each diocese to handle incoming complaints from abuse victims. they've adopted now formal complaint procedures, and they put those procedures on the diocesan website. They've now formally adopted policies, communications plans, and policies that commit each diocese to openness. Are any of those things bad? Of course not. Do any of those things strike at the root? They really don't. Because bishops still have as much power as they ever did. Now, I know that some people think that's cynical. They say, well, gosh, in this era now, of increased media attention and litigation and victims coming forward and powerful lay organizations like Voice of the Faithful, isn't their power really checked? On my better days, I think, yes, it is. But then I quickly realized only temporarily. Only temporarily. Has there been, other than in those handful of states where survivors and their advocates and their lawyers have managed to change or extend or eliminate or reform the statute of limitations, have there been any other structural reforms that really diminish the power of a bishop? And I'm very sad to say, I really don't think that there have been. So I think those are the way, when we think, what do we do next? Those are the two questions I think we need to ask ourselves. What are we doing that makes it easier and more likely for victims to come forward? And what are we doing to make sure that we do whatever we can to minimize, reduce the power of the bishops? Because at its core, I think this is obviously a problem, a crisis, or an era, as Steve said, that has been brought about because of the misuse of power by the leadership of the church. Now, in very practical terms, then what do we do? Where do we go from here? I think we had the perfect example, frankly, in what Belinda said. And if you listen to what Belinda said, that's what we need to be doing. Bob said in his introduction, what does she do? She listens to people. She listens to survivors. Hour after hour. She talked about driving and going to see them. She talked about creating a library, resources, help, tangible help for people who are hurting. Exposing the truth, through this incredible report. The kind of report that obviously, every bishop should have produced long ago and should update annually and should have on the diocesan website, exposing the truth. And you notice what else she did? And continues to do? Asks bishops to do the right thing. Not out of naivete, not believing that they will, but knowing that in fact they do still have all the power. And if we don't ask, we don't get. And when they don't do what they're supposed to do, she does it for them. And that I submit, that's what our organization has done since day one. We have done the bishops' jobs for them. The job of rooting out the bad apples, the job of exposing the bad apples, the job of listening to and going out and finding the lost sheep. In many ways, I used to do political consulting, and there would always come a point in a political campaign where you'd done the advertising and you had teams of people going out door knocking and you were doing all that stuff. And you were maybe 2 weeks away from the election, and people on the campaign started kind of brainstorming these wild ideas. Why don't we try this? Why don't we try that? And it was a period where people, what was really setting in, frankly, was boredom. Because anybody here ever work on political campaigns? Much of what you do is hideously boring, right? How many times can you pound yard signs, with a hammer? And how many times can you, stuff envelopes? And how many times can you ring doorbells and say the same damn thing over and over again? Well, in a lot of respects, as I go around the country and as I talk to survivors around the country, some of that frustration and boredom is setting in. Because we keep doing the same thing. We keep leafleting in front of churches. We keep starting support groups. We keep answering the phone and listening to people cry. We keep talking to reporters. But you know what? Even though it's hard and even though it's boring and even though it's tedious, that's what makes the difference. Because all of that does help create a climate that enables victims to come forward. And so as you leave and think about what we do from here, I would encourage you to think about what has worked and stick with it. And I would encourage you to think about what helps victims come forward, what takes power away from the bishops. And I would encourage you to follow Belinda's courageous lead, and let's continue to do the bishop's jobs